I'm in one of Georgia's oldest towns, and indeed one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on earth. This is Mtskheta, at the confluence of two rivers, the Kura and the Agravi. Rivers come together here in a small valley that was as strategic in ancient times as it is beautiful today. I arrived here a couple of days ago when there just happened to be an important religious festival day in progress, and the streets were thronged with people who'd come here from all over. This town has a population of just over 7,000, but for more than 1,000 years, beginning in about 500 BC, Mtskheta was a fortified city and the capital of the ancient kingdom of Iberia, not to be confused with the Iberia of Spain and Portugal. This Iberia was the precursor nation to Georgia. This was Georgia's first capital, and it remained so until the early 1100s. And despite its size, it's still the country's most important religious center. The dominant Georgian Orthodox Church here has its roots in this town, and Mtskheta continues to be the church's headquarters. From the moment you arrive here, you sense that you're in a special place. Mtskheta is a charming town that draws plenty of tourists, but it has a pleasant, normal ambiance. In fact, I'd say it's the perfect little town to kick back and relax.
History, religion, and tradition are strongly entangled here. An example is a woman named Nino, that's to say Saint Nino, who came here in the early 4th century to preach the gospel. She famously converted the king and queen to Christianity, and in the year 337, it officially became the state religion.
If you were to come here knowing nothing about Georgia, this is probably the last place you'd expect to discover was once the country's capital. Of course, that was more than 1,000 years ago, but still, it's a town with a glorious history that happens to be about, well, not far away from Georgia's present-day capital. You might even say that it's steadily getting closer to Tbilisi, or more accurately, that Tbilisi is getting closer to it. It's so close to the city, and yet surrounded as it is by hills, and with its historic zones accorded protections. You notice that almost every property is loaded with fruit trees. Apples, outstandingly. Georgians love their wines, and even the smallest of gardens has grape trellises for growing wine grapes. And in the case of my guest house, the neighbors on the other side of the small street where it's located ran out of space for their trellises, and so they just erected them completely over the street. And that's okay too, I guess.
I'm staying at the delightful guest house at Tbilisi in the heart of town, with a wonderful patio overlooking the cathedral and one of the more generous breakfasts I've encountered anywhere. The kind French lady who runs the place asked if I wanted ham and cheese sandwiches along with breakfast, and each day 4 show up on my plate. 2 for breakfast, 2 for lunch. The landmark that dominates Mtsketa's skyline, Svetitskhoveli Cathedral, is more than 1,000 years old and surrounded by a stone wall. This magnificent building, which is a World Heritage Site along with other structures in and near town, has stood here since the year 1029.
These grounds have been the center of what became the Georgian Orthodox faith for 1,700 years. It's also the burial place of Georgian kings down through the centuries, including the legendary 5th century king, Vakhtang Gorgasali, the man responsible for moving the capital from here to Tbilisi. When you consider that the wall surrounding this place wasn't built until the late 1700s, it's remarkable that the cathedral itself has remained as intact as it is through all these centuries, especially when you consider the invasions by Arabs, Mongols, Persians, Timur, the great leader from Uzbekistan, and of course, the Russians. There are at least 4 places in Europe which claimed to house part or all of the robe worn by Christ at the time of his execution. One of them is this cathedral. Tradition has it that a Jewish rabbi from Georgia who was in Jerusalem at the time of Christ's death bought it from a Roman soldier and brought it here. The Georgian Orthodox regard this church as the second holiest place on earth outside Jerusalem. Within church circles, Mtskheta is considered a holy city, which gets us to a second tradition very important in Georgian Orthodox iconography, the so-called living pillar. That Jewish rabbi who is said to have brought Christ's robe here, he had a sister named Sidonia who it is claimed fell dead from emotion after touching the robe. Tradition has it that the robe couldn't be removed from her hands, and so the crypt behind me, which contains the robe, is also the burial crypt of Sidonia.
The imagery of the robe and the legend of Sidonia is very much a part of iconography here, as you can see from this ceremony beside the crypt.
Რომელთა შეგიმზადეს ლევისა გალობაი
This is Jvari Monastery, among the more significant historical places in Georgia. It's also the best place to take in the view of Mtskheta. Saint Nino is said to have brought King Mirian III and Queen Nana here 1700 years ago to convince them to accept Christianity.
The evangelizer, the woman who would later be known as Saint Nino, erected a small wooden church on this hilltop, and after her death, it became a popular pilgrimage site within Orthodox Christendom, until finally, in the 6th century, this monastery was built here. It was built primarily because there were so many pilgrims coming to the hilltop, the pre-existing church could no longer accommodate them. If you look at Orthodox churches throughout Georgia and Armenia, many of them have something in common. They're modeled after this building. Many of these churches were built in the so-called Jvari style, with its familiar 8-faceted dome and an overall design with elements emphasizing harmony with nature. The style became characteristic of medieval Georgian architecture, beyond merely churches. This building has stood here since it was completed in the year 605, although Arabs set fire to it in the year 914 during an invasion that marked the last attempt at Muslim hegemony in the South Caucasus. Jvari managed to survive with only minor repairs. The Soviets in the 20th century retained it as a national monument. Still, for much of the Soviet era, access to this hilltop was restricted by the presence of a military post. In 1991, after Georgian independence, Jvari was restored as a church, and 3 years later, it was declared a World Heritage Site. As the tour buses and cars come and go up here from Tbilisi, which is only about a 30-minute drive, one is tempted to describe this in preservation terms as a happy outcome. But you should know that this building is deteriorating and is considered endangered. The culprit, erosion from acid rain and high winds. As grand as this place is, on the inside it is, I'm sorry to say, not terribly impressive. I don't mean to diminish its importance, or even the interest of going inside, but you can see the evidence in there of how deteriorated the building has become. There are scaffoldings with wood that prevent you from looking up to the dome from inside, and also iron pillars that perhaps keep the place from falling down. But at any rate, it's historic, but in terms of grandiosity, not so much. The real strength of this place, aside from its historic merit, is the view. You come up here and you begin to think about what it must have been like in the days of Nino. And you can't help but be inspired.
Samtavro Monastery is another site of historic significance that most visitors to Mtskheta choose not to miss.
Samtavro in Georgian means ruler's place, and inside the monastery are the tombs of ancient King Mirian III and Queen Nana, responsible for Christianity becoming the state religion here. The original construction of this monastery and church took place during their lifetimes in the 300s, although what you see was rebuilt likely at about the time the cathedral was constructed, between the years 1010 and 1029 CE. I'm going to step inside and make my way to one corner of the monastery, to where the tombs of the king and queen are located.
What you're about to hear happen is a surprise encounter with a rather stern nun.
Don't take. No, I can see. Don't take.
And with a pronounced twist of her index finger, I found myself being marched out of the building. There would be no negotiation.
None. I was able to reach an administrator here who did allow me back in, but it was a sensitive moment. A Russian pilgrimage group had just entered the church, and while not an official ceremony, there was a service taking place with songs in Russian. Turned out all right. There was another nun who was my quote-unquote protector, who followed me back in and sort of cleared things up with the original nun so that I could take a few photos, including a quick photo of the crypts.
And here they are. That's King Mirian III's tomb on the left and Queen Nana on the right. In a corner of the monastery grounds is maybe the tiniest church I've ever seen.
Originally, this site is said to have been a favorite place for Nino to come to pray and to meditate, and she had a small wooden church built for that purpose. That's the church behind me, sort of. As you can see, it is small, but it is not a wooden church. It is a rebuilt church called the Church of Saint Nino, on the same spot.
The dimensions are said to be the same as the original. You can barely turn around inside.
There's a curtain here, as you see, and that says it's the altar, and there's a sign on it which says "Do not touch." And I think after my experience with the nun just a few minutes ago, I won't touch it.